Okay, so this video is about color theory, which is how colors relate to each other and how you can pick out ones that send certain messages. It's also about watercolor techniques and about different types of shapes. So several different things in one. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a color wheel in our sketchbook, have some explanations of what the different colors mean and what they do. And each color we're going to use a different watercolor technique. So you're going to need your sketchbook, you're going to need a ballpoint pen, you're going to need an assortment of watercolor brushes, like not this one, just kidding. Assortment of watercolor brushes. How you know it's a watercolor brush is if the fur of it is really kind of fluffy and soft, then it will work well for watercolor. If the fur of it is really scratchy and kind of stiff, that's not going to work for watercolor because it will just like scratch your paper. So something like this is a no. The one exception to that is you're going to have a toothbrush that we're going to use for a really specific purpose, so get one of those too. You're going to need a cup of clean water to rinse your brush. You're going to need a paper towel to dry things off with. You're going to need a paint box, and if you look through the paint box drawer, this is the best brand. It's called Prang, and it should have these 4 colors in it. Some of them may have more colors, but as long as it's the Prang brand, that's good, and as long as you have at least these, the red, yellow, blue, and black, that'll be cool. Make sure that this part here is cleaned out. You can just take a wet paper towel and wipe it if it's not clean, because this is where we mix our colors and prepare them. And then you're going to need just a little piece of scrap paper, just kind of whatever that you have. Okay, so we're going to start by drawing out our color wheel. So let's start by making a geometric shape, and these will represent our primary colors. So for something to be considered a geometric shape, it's going to have most or all of these characteristics. It's going to have straight lines and angles. It's going to have a name that you recognize. It's not like a weird word, like a normal shape name, and it's going to be something that you could study in math class and figure out like the perimeter or the area or other stuff like that, math kind of wise. So I'm going to choose triangles because I want to. So I'm going to draw 3 triangles kind of spaced apart in my sketchbook. So these triangles are going to represent my primary colors. You can do whatever geometric shape you want. So primary colors are why we have the red, yellow, and blue in this paint box. They're colors that you need to have in order to mix other colors. So let's put for our little answer key, need these, can't spell today, to mix other colors. Okay, so let's start by doing a technique called a wash for our first one. So to do a wash, you're going to get some clean water, and you're going to use a really, really fluffy paintbrush. Like one of these is good, or some other brush that's just really, really soft and fluffy. So you're going to put a thin layer of clean water down where we want our wash. And then we're going to get our color ready. So let's start with yellow just for fun. So in your little paint box, you're going to, with your wet paintbrush, kind of swirl it around to pick up some color. And then you're going to move it over to the palette to kind of get it ready to use. So you shouldn't be like loading water into here to get it like runny and painty. You should be just kind of pick it up here, move it over here. If we need to add more water in here to lighten it up or whatever, that's where this happens, is in this little palette section. Because if you put tons of water in the paint like little thingy, it'll just like melt the paint away too quickly because the water will just dissolve it. So get some paint ready, and then we're going to fill in on our already wet section here, and this is what we call a wash. Can you see that color? It's kind of light. So a wash usually is pretty light, and you can see that the color really spread out and kind of flowed to cover wherever the water was. So this is a really good technique to know about if you need your color to be really spread out, like a good background or something like that. So in between every color we go in, we're going to rinse our brush out, so just kind of like pat it in the, sort of stomp it around in the water, kind of get the extra off. And you never, ever, ever want to leave a paintbrush sitting in a cup of water because that weakens the glue that holds this into this little handle, and the hair will start to fall out, and that's just gross. Okay, so yellow we've done with the wash technique. So this is clean water plus paint. Okay, so the next one we're going to do is we're going to do something called wet on wet. So this starts out the same way as a wash. So let's just lay down some clean water. And then let's do red next. It doesn't really matter what order you put these in, as long as you pay attention to how you're doing it. So I'm getting this red paint ready, and now I'm going to paint it on here. And it's kind of light, but it still counts as red, so that's cool. Spread it out here. Okay, cleaning my brush. So now I'm going to switch to a different brush, and I'm going to do the wet on wet technique. So to do wet on wet, you have some paint that's still wet, obviously, and then you put more paint over it. So it's going to give you a certain effect by doing that. So I'm going to just add more red since we're doing this color wheel business. But if you were doing in real life, you could do any other color you wanted. But what's going to happen with this extra paint that I'm going to put on is it's going to kind of spread out and be like blurry on the edges. Whoops. This would be slightly more effective if my wash had dried just a tiny, tiny bit. But you can see how I'm kind of making some different like designs here, and they're sort of blurry on the edges, but they're also sort of defined. So that can be a way to make some lines or some shapes or whatever that are sort of, like I just said, blurry but sort of defined. So wet on wet, wet paint plus wet paint. Okay, so next we're going to do something called wet on dry, and so this is probably how you just think of painting normally. This is kind of just the typical way of painting. I'm actually going to take a second and clean out my palette here before I move on. So I'm just getting a little bit of water out of my water cup, and then I'm just going to sort of clean this out so I don't mix things by mistake. And then I'll be ready to go with the blue. Okay, so let's get some blue ready. Got some water on my paintbrush, getting some blue here, moving it over. Okay, so now my blue paint is ready. And now I'm just going to leave this section dry and just add on to it. And so wet on dry, paper is dry, your paint is wet. So you can see that the edges of these paint marks are really, really crisp and clear. So this is something to keep in mind if you want your edges of any shapes or lines that you're doing to stay really strong and bold. If you don't want them to be strong and bold, then you're going to do a wash or a wet on wet. I kind of made a mess of this, I'm sorry, but you understand. Wet on dry, dry paper, wet paint. Okay, so So next we're going to do our secondary colors. So let's do an organic shape for our secondary colors. And so an organic shape is like the opposite of a geometric. So generally does not have a name like a regular shape name, usually is more kind of curvy or blobby sort of, and you don't have an easy way to figure out things like the perimeter or the area or anything like that. So let's just make a little blobby guy, like a little cloud. That's going to be our secondary colors. So these are mixed out of primaries. So this one here is going to be the combination of the yellow and the red. So this is going to be orange. So now we need to make some orange. So get some water, get a little yellow out of here. Whenever you're mixing colors, you want to start with a lighter color first because you need a little more of it because it's less strong. So yellow is lighter and less strong, so I'm going to start with that first. Now clean my brush off. Get a little bit of red. I'm just going to start with a little at a time. Alright, that looks pretty good, I think. So what technique am I going to do next? Okay, so I'm going to do something called a dry brush. And this is a little bit weird. And oftentimes this dry brush technique happens by mistake and then you're like, ew, why does that look so gross? But if you do it on purpose, it can look pretty cool. So you're going to get the paint on the brush and then you're going to kind of pat it dry on your paper towel. And then this, oops, not dry enough. Actually, I'm going to mix up some more paint so it's a little bit more intense here. So just a second. What this is going to do, if you've ever painted with watercolors and had it come out really, really scratchy looking, you probably did dry brush by mistake. We're going to do it on purpose. And this can make a really cool texture. Like a lot of times if you see a watercolor painting and they've got something like wood grain texture, or like grass texture or something like that, maybe like animal fur, they'll do a dry brush technique. Actually need a little more yellow here. Alright, that looks pretty good. So load up your brush with your mixed paint, and then we're going to pat it dry. And then this should, oh, it's still not really doing it. It's doing a little bit. I don't know if you can really see that. But theoretically, yeah, you can kind of see that happening. See how it's a little scratchy around there. So a dry brush is going to come out to be as kind of a scratchy effect. So something that's working against me here is that this is not the ideal paper for using watercolors. When you do your real project, you'll be on watercolor paper, so it will be much better. So dry brush, dry off the brush, and use on dry paper. Okay, so next we're going to do the combination of these two primary colors to make this secondary color, which is going to be purple. So let's do something that I call lift off, or you could call it blotted. So we're going to start this, I'm going to do put my water down first. So this starts out kind of like a wash, but then we're going to change it a little bit after. Let's put our water down so it won't be as wet. And now we're going to mix some purple. So I'm going to say that red looks a little bit lighter, so I'm going to start with that. Put down some red. Clean my brush. And then get some blue, mix in the blue to make a nice purple. Here we go. I'm actually going to try using this brush instead for my wash, just because it might be a little more controllable for this small area. So I'm going to lay down this purple on top of the water. You can see, again, like a wash, it's spreading out really nicely, kind of evening out. Clean in my brush. And then for this, we're going to take some of our paper towel and kind of blot at this wash. And this is another cool way of making a texture happen. And again, I don't know if the camera is really picking this up, but it's kind of making it like a little kind of crumply sponge kind of texture. So yeah, this can, again, good way to make a texture. So lift off, wash, then blot with paper towel. Okay. Now, secondary color is green, yellow, and blue. Makes green. So let's just clean ourselves off some space here. Okay, so make some green. So starting with the yellow. And I'm just going to add a smidge of blue, because blue is very strong. Okay, that's getting there. Add a smidge more. Yeah. Okay, so what technique should I do here? Okay, I'm going to do a wicked fun one here. So I've got this, you know what, I actually need to make a little stronger paint for this technique. We're going to use the toothbrush for this, and we're going to do some splatter painting, but it's going to be a controlled splatter painting. So let's just get a little more paint so we have something to work with. Oh, whoa, I went too far in the other direction there. That's not even green anymore. That's like blue-green. I wasn't being very careful, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, that's better. That's good. That's nice. Okay, so this controlled splatter painting is why we have our little piece of scrap paper. So when you're doing your real painting, you might want to think about how to make some kind of stencil that will work for what you're making. I'm just going to tear this so that we can kind of do it fastish. But you could make any kind of shape that you want. So I've got my stencil here. I'm going to load up the brush with my green paint, the toothbrush. And then, actually, let's do a little variation thing here. So then I'm just going to splatter with my thumb. So I'm going to keep the toothbrush really close to my paper. I'm not going to hold it out like this because that's going to go everywhere. So keep it really close and just use your thumb. So I made little splatters, and then you can see where the stencil was, it blocked it off. So that can be a super, super awesome thing to do to be able to control your splatter paint situation. So now the second place that I'm doing is going to come out a little bit lighter because it hasn't had as much splattering. So now I've got a little value variation too. So that was splatter paint with stencil. Okay, so that's our 6 techniques. So then for our last section of colors, you can do whatever kind of thing you want. Let's do Yeah, do whatever kind of shape you want too, but just keep it consistent so that we can make our little answer key here. So I'm actually going to make a circle, and I kind of have a weird thought about circles. I honestly don't really know if they're organic or geometric. Sometimes I think one way and sometimes I think the other, because you can measure the area and their circumference and everything like a mathy thing, and it has a name, but it's also kind of curved and round and natural looking. So I don't really know how to call it. I think it's kind of in between. So this is going to be something called tertiary, which is a weird word. So tertiary. It comes from a root word that means third. So these are the third colors that you mix, and we mix them out of a combination of a secondary and a primary that are next to each other. You just block this off because that's confusing. So for instance, yellow and orange are going to make yellow-orange. So I'm probably not going to show this whole thing because that'll take forever, but let's just do, actually since I have some green right here, let's do a yellow-green and put it right there. So do whatever kind of techniques that you want. You can mix it up for this last section, and just kind of fill in these colors. So to make yellow-green, we're going to use less blue than we did before. If it's tricky for you to get the color correct and have it look right, you can mix up the secondary color first and then add more of the primary to it, and that might make it a little bit easier. So I'm just going to do, wet on dry for this. That's not even dark enough. I'm having some troubles with making these colors dark enough for some reason. I'm very sorry about that. I'm using too much water. How much water you use with watercolor controls the value of the color. So if you want a lighter value, you're going to use more water, because then the paper, the white paper, can show through. If you want a darker value, you're going to use less water. So people are always like, why don't I have white paint? Well, because you don't need it. The end. Is that yellow-green yet? Not really. What's that blob of gross coming from? What happened here? Okay. Okay. This is good. Okay, yellow-green. So I'm just going to do the rest of these real quick. So there's all of my colors. So yellow, red, blue, primary colors, orange, purple, and green are our secondaries, and then yellow, orange, red, violet, blue, green, and yellow, green are our tertiary colors. So a few more color theory things and then we'll be done. So just a few basic things that you need to know about how colors go together. One thing is, when colors are directly opposite from each other, we call those complementary. How do I spell this? E? Yes. So complementary colors are opposites. So any of these opposites, we mostly talk about the primary and secondary opposites, but you could kind of do it with tertiaries as well. Those don't really matter quite as much though, but these ones are the main sets of complementary colors. So when you have these next to each other, they make each other really stand out because they're high contrast. They're very, very different. And if you were to blend these together, like if you wanted to mix blue and orange, it would kind of turn into like a poop color. So turn into caca color when mixed. Okay. So another thing that you need to know is something called analogous colors. So analogous colors are the ones that are next to each other. So for instance, if I took this purple, the red, violet, and the red, this whole cluster here is analogous. It's kind of a weird word. So next to each other. They go together really well because they have a lot in common. For instance, this group all has red in common. So they're all either are red or they're made with red. So lots in common and go together well. Okay. Complementary colors, I'm going to put an arrow to symbolize that they're across from each other. Okay, let's see. Couple more things. So when you have dark and light of the same color, we call that monochromatic. So for instance, in this section here where I've got the wet on wet of the red, this is monochromatic because I've got darker red and I've got medium red and I've got lighter red. So monochromatic, dark and light of one color. So this obviously is the color scheme that goes together the best because there's nothing to like make any trouble, like, you know, there's no weirdness like there is with complementary. So this is kind of can be like a really, really strong kind of emotion, a really just one message here. Yeah. Doesn't have much variety, but can be a good color scheme nonetheless. One more thing that I want to mention that you need to know is that some colors are warm and some colors are cool. So all of these things here so those are colors that kind of look like the sky or like water or like if you look in your bathtub, the cold water faucet will have a blue label on the handle. So these just remind you of cold things. It's actually a psychological thing that happens with your brain. So these colors here on the opposite side are warm colors. So these are colors that remind you of fire or sunshine, or like when the burner on the stove is on and it gets all red because it's really hot. So warm colors. So these you can use to help send your message if it's calm and peaceful, or if it's warm or like angry or aggressive. Those colors can do different things. So that is our color theory and paint mixing and paint use and shape review all in one. Okay, the end.